Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 8th episode of Ask CESO Communications. I hope you will go back and check the other 7 episodes that we've put out. We talked about websites, storytelling, crisis communications, branding, enrollment marketing, public engagement, and last time we talked about graphic design. But today we're going to talk about elections. First, let me tell you who we are. We are the Center for Effective School Operations, or CESO, and we provide support services to school districts. We are on the communication team for CESO, but CESO also has a transportation, a finance, an HR, and a technology services division. So this format for this show is in a Q&A. So we're going to be posing the questions that we get from our clients about elections, and then we also have a question that somebody posed to us, and we want to get an answer for them. So I would like to get your panel now, and I'm going to introduce them to you. We have Julie Thannum, APR, who's a senior strategist with CESO. She's accredited in public relations and has more than 32 years of experience in school communications. She's past TSPA president, a recipient of TSPA's Bright Idea and Most Valuable Member Awards, and just recently, along with our team at CESO, won TSPA's President's Award after serving a stint for them as interim executive director. She's also a past NSPA president and received NSPA's highest award, the President's Award, in 2022. Julie's been a senior strategist for CESO since 2021. We also have Kyle Noyed, a communication strategist for CESO. He is a storyteller and a strategist. He's focused on effective and consistent messaging that earns community trust and drives the organization's mission. His 10 years of experience include referendum campaigns, communications auditing and planning, and managing organizations' day-to-day communication efforts through tactics like website creation, social media, email newsletters, and political campaigns. And I'm Nicole Kirby. I don't have Justin to introduce me, so I'll just tell you that I've been with CESO since 2022, and I've done a few things before that too. So, but we'll focus mostly on Julie and Kyle today. So thank you guys for being here today to share your wisdom with our folks. And I'm going to jump right in with the first question. Julie, what kind of communication is required when you have an election on the ballot?
Well, hello. I think that this topic is one that we can all relate to because it feels like in public education, we're always in election mode, whether it's a trustee election, some sort of a bond referendum, or a tax levy or something for operations. There's always some election that we're in the middle of or approaching at some point. There's a lot of different requirements across the states, Nicole, and we certainly couldn't cover all of those in the time we have allotted here. But one of the key things to know is that you have to kind of study and research what the rules and requirements are in your particular state. I know that there are typically deadlines for not only calling an election, but the various election orders that have to be posted. There's a lot of internet posting requirements. And so it's really important as communicators in public schools to understand what the election laws are, what the requirements are for communicating, and get those postings done in a timely fashion. Because the last thing you want to do is start your election off on the wrong foot by missing an important deadline. You have to be transparent and factual. So the information that you put out, while not required necessarily, it is a part of communicating factual information about the election. I know we're going to talk a little bit about neutrality and what is required of public schools in most states across the nation. So I think it's important that you include the basics. When to vote, where to vote, that kind of information can get kind of complicated. A lot of times people can't remember or don't know if they're supposed to vote in a certain precinct, in a certain location, what the rules are for early voting in your particular county or state. And just have to keep those deadlines in mind, because a lot of times we can be communicating about an election, but not tell people what the deadline is to get registered to vote. So if you have new folks coming into your school district, or individuals, unfortunately, like we have all the time, people who have never registered to vote, who have been living in your district for a long time, those individuals need to know how easy it is to get registered to vote. And so we're going to talk a little bit later, I think, about the creating a culture of voting. But that's just some of the things that I think that need to be clearly communicated when you're calling an election, whether it's an election for school board, which I know here in Texas, where I'm at, we're all in different states. So it can be different for all of our listeners and participants too, and some of our clients. So I know at CESO, we have to study up. If we're helping someone with an election, we have to find out that we have to know those deadlines and timelines. And as a school communicator, you should too.
Absolutely. When should we start communicating about an election, Kyle?
You should kind of never stop in some ways. Really, it's you're communicating is you're just communicating. You want your community to know what's going on in your schools. You want to know the situation with your district. You want nothing should be a surprise. You should be fiscally transparent throughout the year, but you want to have everything ready to go about the actual plan and what's on the ballot. Once the board approves that election, you really want to be able to start sharing the story of what it is, why it's happening, what it would do, all of those important things that people are going to be wondering. You want to invite people into your schools anyway. You want to have a strong communications program that shows what life is like in your schools. You want people to be able to know what the technology looks like, what the spaces look like, so that when you then come to say, here's what we want to do, maybe to take things to the next level or to repair this old building, you want people to already kind of have an idea of what's going on there. You really just don't want anyone to feel like the only time you start communicating with them is when you want something from them. So I think it's very important to kind of already have a baseline in place, because it can just feel like way too much for some folks if you're just only coming at them with, we have a ballot question, here's all this stuff. So you really want to make sure that you're communicating before you communicate.
Exactly.
How does that work?
Yeah. Well, and really it allows you to layer complex messages, because these financial situations are often so complex. Budgets and the way that we're regulated in the different states are so complex. You can only spend this bucket on these things and that bucket on those things. And so making all of that clear to people sometimes takes time to break it into chunks and explain it. And so when you do what you're saying, Kyle, where you do it ongoing over time, you can break that into pieces and share it with people over time. So that's a really good idea.
I think also it's unfortunate for school communicators, but often they're brought in late in the process. Someone's already decided that an election is needed, and sometimes the school communicators do not have the opportunity to kind of lay that groundwork that Kyle's talking about and work out. We always say we would like to have 12 to 18 months to work on community engagement and do some of the things that you need to do to communicate complex things, because you can have limitations once the election's called. But I know for us, we get called by clients that are a little bit in panic mode sometimes because they've been brought in and said, I found out we're having an election and we got to call it Friday, or, the deadline is here and we're kind of on it. It doesn't mean that we can't help it. Doesn't mean there aren't great things that you can communicate in ways that you can approach that. But you end up really kind of at a disadvantage when you're not forward thinking enough to do that community engagement and lay some of that groundwork and good communications about your school finance and kind of the need for the election in the first place. And whether or not that's a top-down decision, and it happens. It's happened to all of us where someone's just decided this needs to happen. It needs to happen now. So it can certainly still be done well, but it's better. And I think it would be best if you have 12 to 18 months out to do some of the things Kyle described.
Yeah. The number 41 days will forever live in my brain, because that was one that we got. I helped kind of in a panic mode of, this thing's already on the ballot, but we haven't said anything about it. And that's 41 days. And that I do not encourage that. But obviously it can be done. But definitely want to be able to have a system in place before the 41-day mark.
Well, and that made me think of a story too. When I was in my former district, we had we were laying the groundwork for the problem that we were trying to solve with the election, leading up to when that election would get posted on the ballot. And I had somebody from the community call me and say, "Do you know that there's this problem? And what are you guys going to do about it?" And I thought, check, we did what we were supposed to. We established the problem, and I was able to say to that guy, well, actually, here's what we're going to do about it, and you can be a part of that. So all right, let's talk now about kind of different kinds of elections and how they differ. And is the communication different for the different kinds of elections? Julie.
I think the answer to that would be yes. There's all different kinds of elections. You know, I kind of mentioned a few of them, but bond elections for capital improvements, referendums, levies for raising taxes, or asking for a cap to be raised, maybe on the M&O side or the INS side, interest in sinking or maintenance and operations. Getting into that, a little bit of that finance lingo that has to be defined, the complexity of each state and each state's requirements. But, you know, sometimes we forget that there are school board elections, and school board elections, I know for us in our state, are every year, and districts adopt policies, whether that will happen in May, whether it'll happen in November. Sometimes they're staggered a lot. And so you end up having elections every year, and there are certain seats up, and there's always a heavy year where the majority might be up or close to a majority. And so while we remain neutral, obviously, and we're not necessarily, we're definitely not advocating for a particular candidate or anything like that, it becomes kind of like you're in election cycle all the time. And there's just, we know this from local, state, and especially national campaigns and political rhetoric, that sometimes there's a lot of that dialogue going on, a lot of noise going on in the background while you're just trying to carry out school. And you may be neutral and you're just providing election dates and things like that. But that trustee election, while people are vying for open seats or trying to unseat an incumbent or whatever it is, the district can kind of get caught up a little bit in some of those issues and have to answer, you know, factually, some of the questions that come up during those elections. So don't just discount that, oh, trustee elections, they're pretty routine, because sometimes they don't feel very routine. And it can get a little bit like a media circus and just not a great vibe to be working in at the time. But definitely, I think when we think elections, a lot of times we're thinking of bond elections or tax levies or things that are related to money or facilities. And again, you know, back to what I said earlier, that because every state is different, it's very, very important for you to know which type of elections you have. You know, we joke in Texas because we have one called a Vader. I feel like every few years the legislature changes the title of things the way they want to do it. But that's a Vader is a voter approved tax ratification election. And I don't know if there's another state that has or uses the word Vader, but I also know that I was working recently with a colleague, an Innsbruck colleague in her district, and they don't have to have bond elections, and they have their budgets approved by the county, so they don't do elections like that. And I thought, wow, it could be a very great thing not to have to do those types of elections. Now they still have school board elections and governing board elections. So it's different in every state, but I think it's important that we go back to what we fall back on often as accredited public relations and a strategic communications firm and company helping our clients, in that we know that there are 4 steps to communicating, and that's, you know, researching the issue. And we're going to get into this a little bit more here in a few minutes, but researching and planning and implementation and evaluation. And when you talk about, is the communication different for different kinds of elections? Absolutely. Because the rules and the type of election you're having kind of governs a little bit about what your messaging is going to be. But sometimes your target audiences are different. Sometimes you do your research and you find out that the people who typically vote in your district are a certain age and a certain demographic. And so you may tailor your messages to that voting population. You may be trying to increase, right, the participation of a particular audience. whether that's non-English speaking families or whether that's younger families who aren't typically registering and participating in your elections. So when you do that research and you get to that planning stage, one of the things that we really encourage is that your messaging and your target audiences could be different, will be different, depending on the nature of what type of election you have. There are provisions in the law where you have to go out and ask voter approval for increasing or accessing additional tax rate dollars and funds on your M&O, your maintenance and operations, that daily operations budget. And there are also times in certain states where you have to go out and there's a provision in the law that allows you to increase or ask for an increase in the tax cap on the debt service side. And I learned about a type of election that you can do that in Illinois. It has a whole nother name. It's not called a Vader. So I think it's just important to remember that that 4-step process that we're going to get into a little bit more here in a second is so important, because your communication should be different for different elections. And the one thing I do want to point out that I think is really great, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, Nicole, is that Bob Noyed, our vice president, he gives a presentation about communicating complex issues. And he says that, first of all, you want to keep it simple. You can't just use the word M&O and INS and Vader and other type of lingo in elections and in public ed and not explain those things. And as you mentioned, explaining the different buckets and how the budget's broken down and how the budget is spent, all of that's very, very important really to do before you're even in an election mode. But Bob says that you want to keep it simple and you want to repeat it often. So I think repetition is really important, but he says that there are 4 main things to think about. I have them written down here next to my desk because I refer to this a lot. When you're breaking down complex issues, which elections and budget and school finance typically are, you need time. That's talking about that, not waiting to the last minute if you can help it, and doing all that groundwork on a regular basis with your taxpayers and your key stakeholders. You need context. You need to give them the context for why this is important to them, what it means for them, the context. People don't understand what it costs to fund a teacher and to fit a classroom and to build a new school. And we have to give them the context for that. Repetition, they're not going to necessarily have it sink in the first time you say it. So we have to have ongoing communication and repeat those key facts so that they sink in. The best thing is when you're sitting at a board meeting, or like you said, someone says something to you and they repeat back something that you have actually shared in your messaging. And that's just affirmation that repetition and providing that information in advance of the election is important. And then you have something Bob calls messaging, message focus and layering. And you mentioned this, Nicole. It's layering in. It's like kind of giving them a focus of a particular area and then layering in a different additional information as you can. I kind of liken dealing in school finance and communicating it with dealing with a toddler or a child. They ask a question about a sensitive topic that you're not sure they're quite age ready to discuss. You answer their question and you wait to see if they have another question. You don't go into this giant elaborate explanation that's too complex. And a lot of individuals just don't have that time and, quite frankly, the interest in it. So answer their question, and if they want to dig deeper, there's all those individuals in your community that wants to do that. So those are just kind of ways you can tailor your messaging depending on the election itself, the type, and your target audiences.
Mm-hmm. And what they want to know. I like that piece that you mentioned. You mentioned a little bit some of the rules and regulations about what we can and can't say. So, Kyle, with most states having rules about districts not being able to advocate in an election, what does that mean for the informational campaign?
It means you get to stick to the facts. It comes down to, especially on, if it was a referendum type vote where, it's yes or no or approve. What's the Texas thing, Julie? For or against?
Or against, right.
Or against.
The wording, right.
Then it's all, you want everybody to know what the impact of both of those votes are, but you're not necessarily, you can't push anybody to one or the other. It's just kind of giving the facts of, if this thing is approved, this is what happens next. If it's not approved, this is what happens next. So just, sticking to the facts and really just showing what the impact is going to be. The advocacy, that can't be done by the district. That's typically done by some sort of political action committee, other citizens group. And there may be other groups that, are telling people to vote a different way. So just give them the facts, stick with it, stay on your message, and, don't there's a lot of times that when I'm talking with superintendents and stuff, if we're having a meeting, they're like, we want to say this, can't say that, you definitely want to err on the side of caution when it comes to potentially sounding like you're telling someone how to vote, because you don't want to do that. You do want to tell people to vote, though. These are important matters, and these are important local issues that people should go out and participate in. They should arm themselves with the facts, and they should make a decision. So it's your job to give them the facts and allow them to actually go and make their voice heard. Voting is important. Go do it. Yeah. Everybody watching, go do it. But yeah, the big thing is just being consistent and clear throughout the entire process. You can add, if you're hearing things in the community and you need to address some, maybe some talking points or some misinformation, you can do that, but you can only do it with the facts. So it's very important to just very much stay on top of being factual at all times. If you feel like it might be getting over into advocacy, just err on the side of caution. So have a focus on the impact of voting and not a particular way of voting, but hopefully having the facts out there that people can make a very informed decision at the polls.
I think sometimes too that especially those new to school communications may not realize that restriction on advocacy includes not using the copy machine for things that say vote yes or vote no, not using an email system, that even the use of a district's internet system could be seen as using district resources. And so I know that this is stricter in some places than others. And sometimes you get, like right now, we're in an atmosphere of very close scrutiny, that this is one of the areas, Carol, I think you would agree that you just have to walk hand in hand with your bond counsel or with your school attorney, anybody that's advising you. But you also have to kind of weigh that against, the definitions of advocacy and what's kind of acceptable practice. I know that there are very, very conservative interpretations of that would involve no kids in pictures. Well, we're in the kid business. And so I know that there are districts that listen to that counsel and advice. And of course, you definitely want to ask and listen to the people that are going to defend you should you get a complaint. But you don't want to put your whole election at risk because of something that's seen as advocacy. And I know in a lot of places that just even having slogans or showing pictures of actual facilities or kids in photos can kind of be seen as advocacy. So you got to walk that very fine line of storytelling and sharing what's really the situation and making sure people understand. But once you call an election in a lot of states, it changes the way that you can even share the storytelling. And so you just need to walk hand in hand with your legal counsel.
That's right. Our legal counsel in my former district would talk about the red lights and the green light. So red light, please vote. Or red light, please vote yes. Green light, please vote. Kind of like what Kyle was saying. And we ran everything by him. We went above and beyond. In Missouri, you have to put paid for by the such and such school district on everything that's printed. We sometimes put it on things that weren't printed in case somebody printed them. We were just on up in an above and beyond way because we knew that there was increased scrutiny, like you said. All right, let's get into that 4-step communication process that you were talking about, Julie. And let's start with the first step, which is research. What kind of research should you do before an election?
Ooh, my favorite step. Sorry, I was a former journalist, so the research part is my absolute favorite, and I would hang out there all the time if I could. But it is part of the 4-step process that a lot of people skip. They like to jump right to implementation, planning sometimes, and implementation. And so I really do like the research part. Researching for an election has lots of different avenues or roads you can go down. It would be important to understand what's happened in the last several elections, not only the results of those elections, but how certain demographics or precincts or sections, however you want it, neighborhoods, in attendance zones in your school district, how they voted in the past couple of elections. Finding out how many registered voters you have and what percentage that is of the people who actually voted in your last several elections. This kind of stuff I can kind of geek out on some of this data. Not everybody does, I understand that, but it's so important because it can help you frame your communications plan, and the research part of it is key. And one of the things that I should have mentioned in a requirement part is to depending on what your rules are in your state. I know in our state, we have to communicate election materials in certain languages. And it's not just the language that a second language or a prevalent language that you might have in your district. It's what the county identifies as a predominant or prevalent language. So I know in my past district, we not only, which is not surprising in Texas, we had to produce things in English and we had to produce them in Spanish, but Vietnamese was not a population that was very large in our district, but because we partnered with the county to hold an election, the county laws required us, the state laws required us to also provide the communications in Vietnamese. So you have to think about those translations and those types of things. So research what the requirements are in your state, not only for deadlines and timelines, but maybe for producing, distributing election information, whether it has to be on the internet, whether your school board meetings where you call the election have to be televised or the minutes posted. Usually there's an election order posted. All of those things are part of the research. And a school communicator who knows their stuff and has done their research can really serve as a resource for others in the school district who may not have that kind of knowledge for in an election. It's important for you to look at your demographic study. If you're calling a bond election, for instance, what's the age of your buildings? What's the last time the roof was fixed? When does the life cycle of your HVAC or your roof end? Are you nearing those technology life cycle ends? How do you fund technology type purchases? Because people get worried about paying for a 3-year computer for 20 years or 30 years. So a lot of school districts, a lot of states have a mechanism for paying off those short-term assets on a short-term basis rather than layering that debt out for so long. It's complex. There's a lot of information to understand. Sometimes it is looking at what other items are on the ballot. So if you've called an election, and I know it's different everywhere, but in Texas, you're not allowed to call a special election anymore. You have to call an election. It has to be on a general election. You can call a special election, but it has to be on a general election date. So we're only looking at May and November now. And if you're going to hold a tax ratification election, you can only do that in November. And calling an election in November requires a little bit longer timelines for calling it than the timelines in May. So there's all of these rules and complex things that have to be covered, and your research helps you in that form or fashion. I like to research what districts around you are holding an election, what's on their ballots. If you don't look at what else is on the ballot, especially if you're partnering with the county or you're looking at a state ballot. I know this last November, we had 14 constitutional amendments on the Texas ballot. So it was important for us to not only communicate for our clients who were having an elections, a special election, maybe they were having a trustee election, or maybe they were calling a Vader or a bond election, but what else was going to appear on the ballot and how much of that should we try to explain to voters when they go? Required wording on a ballot. We have that as well. They make it harder and harder for public education. I can say that here. They're making it harder and harder for us to be able to explain things because they want to make it sound a certain way. And so they require ballot language when you call the election. So all of these things are forms of research. Your demographic study, how much are you growing? What are the trends? Are you closing schools? You know, we worked with a district not too long ago that had some trends that were coming. They've been a fast growth district that had slowed down since the pandemic, like many districts have, but their demographer came out and said, wait, you're growing, but you're growing in the wrong spots in your district. It was kind of an east-west division. And, you know, just as an example, you've got space in the west, but your growth is in the east. Well, you guys know what that means. That means, well, what happens if we're not opening schools and we're closing and repurposing schools, but we're having an election to do that? It gets very complicated to try to explain, yes, we're growing, not as much, but in the wrong spots. So we're going to close these schools or adjust attendance zones. So those implications of a vote yes or a vote no, or for or against, as we have here in Texas, those things are really important parts of your research. I don't think you can research too much. I really don't. Now, it may be for you personally. You may not want to walk into a meeting and have a notebook thick of your research, but understanding trends. I love to sit with clients and I'll ask a question of their demographer, and then later they'll be like, that was a really great question. I didn't think of that. We do that in a lot of, we have a lot of opportunities to do that because we have time to do. That's one of the things we offer districts, especially the research and evaluation part of it are the parts that they often don't plan for. So that's just a little idea. You guys may think of a couple other things, but I just want to know what's happened in elections. I want to have every opportunity to put a communications plan together for the election that is strategic and well thought out and is based on research, so that I can formulate some measurable things for the next step, which I know you'd probably love to go into. I could talk about research all day, so I won't do that.
Well, it's one of my favorite things as well. And so I'm going to jump into with my favorite kind of research for an election, and that is doing a full survey, investing in a full phone survey of your community that is done in a scientific randomized way, which allows you to extrapolate out to the whole community. So like you see in national elections, if you have a certain percentage of the community that is part of this survey, then you can say with reasonable assurance that the entire population believes this with a plus or minus confidence interval. And so it allows you to say, our community will support X. They'll support it at this level, but they won't support it at this level. These messages resonate with them. These messages don't resonate with them. And I think it's important to do that kind of research early on in the process so that you can change not just your messaging, but also whether or not you even go to the ballot, or what is included in the proposal based on what people are willing to support. And so I think that that's an important research to do as early on in the process as possible.
Totally agree. And a lot of times districts, it's not the communications person that doesn't want to do that, right? But there are districts that are like, we're not doing a survey, or we can't afford a scientific survey or whatever. And I agree, doing it early on so you can formulate the plan. Some people wait and they decide to do a survey after the election's already called, and you can't go back and revise the election order and things like that. And so it is good to do it early on. But one thing to keep in mind, if you can't support a scientific survey, even getting something out there for some engagement in the community to hear from not just maybe citizens that you have on a planning committee that are very invested and very well informed, and they have certain opinions because it involves their kids or programs that their kids are involved in. They're very connected and attached. That does not mean that those, 35, 50, sometimes 60, sometimes these committees are pretty large. Those planning committees for especially bond elections and facility recommendations, they're very invested. That does not mean that that's how vested, and probably they won't be, the rest of the voters will not be that engaged or care near as much as the people in that room. So that's why the survey becomes so important in that public input. But you can even if you have to do a simple Google form or a less scientific informal survey, offering people the opportunity to send questions in or to give you comments or to monitor some of that community feedback, focus groups, whatever. There's lots of different ways you can conduct that research. But I think that doing it early is the key so that you can put together a plan that has the best opportunity to receive approval and support from your community. After all, we're all serving in a capacity. It's their schools, right? You may be living in the community, it might be your schools too, but you're one voter. You want to build the type of school district, whether that's the instructional program, special programs, extracurriculars, also facilities that your community wants for their kids. And it's important for you to do that research ahead of time. So early on, start early.
And being able to say, we adjusted this plan, or we changed this plan based on your input. You said that you wanted us to focus on this. That's what we're focused on is a huge thing. I think if you're worried about surveying your community and you don't want to do that, you just want to go ahead. The election is going to be the survey, and you don't want the election to be the survey. You want to know what could happen and what the plan is going to, different plans to consider before you put something on the ballot. Because if you just put something on the ballot and let people vote, now you've got a whole lot more waiting to do.
Such a great point. That's like a red flag to me. When we have districts come to us and they're like, well, no one wants to survey, or we're not going to ask the community. We kind of know what's best. That's a red flag right there, that maybe you haven't had the kind of engagement and involvement and research ahead of time that you should have leading up. Doesn't mean you can't still have, a successful election, but I do think it's a red flag for us in identifying ways to be effective.
Engagement can cost some money, but a big no on an election is probably going to cost you more in the long run.
100%. Okay, let's talk about the next step in the strategic planning process, which is planning.
Yes.
What does that involve when we're talking about an election, Julie?
I think there's some things that come to mind when you get into the planning for an election. First of all, goals. And I should point out that a lot of people talk about SMART goals, and goals are not supposed to be SMART. They're broader. They're more kind of visionary, a little bit more general. They're overarching goals. And most people say, well, for an election, your goal is to pass the election. Well, if you're thinking the way you should, as it not be an advocacy, you should be thinking that the goals of the election are much different than that, because it's transparency, right? It's promoting transparency. It's providing facts. It's having informed voters. So when you start thinking about those types of goals, whether just winning or losing, and obviously you wouldn't be calling an election if there weren't some members of either your school community on a citizens committee or whatever that believes this should pass. Your overarching goals for an information campaign ought to be reaching those audiences who either don't participate or not registered or haven't traditionally been supportive in the past, with additional information, with good facts, with a good fact campaign. So those are kind of your overarching goals, and they can be different for different communities. We've gone in where I remember back in the day, one of the districts I worked in, pretty much if the teachers and the people who live in the community and worked in the district got out to vote, you could pass an election. Those days are kind of going away. And a lot of districts don't have enough informed staff members who are registered or live in their district to be able to do that. And so they have to reach out. And a lot of times, unfortunately, for those districts, their voting population tends to be 55 and older and not connected to the district. That is a huge challenge. And so your goals should match what your plan is and what you're hoping to accomplish in the election beyond just passing or failing. So where you're smart, people say, well, if it's not SMART goals, I've always heard that. Well, you need SMART objectives.
SMART is specific, measurable, achievable.
Specific, measurable, achievable or attainable. I've heard it both ways. Relevant and timely. So your objectives are the things that you want to be way more specific. You want to talk a little bit, and this might be an example of saying, instead of just saying we want to create a general awareness about the election, like we want to increase the number of registered voters by 5% between this date and this date. So you get much more specific. It's measurable. At the end of it, you may not meet all of the things that you set out to do, but you can at least measure your effectiveness towards that and your ability to meet those goals or those objectives. So I think the objectives are very, very important. Another thing you want to identify during the planning stage are your target audiences. So these are going to be internal or external audiences, and there's a little debate on who's who, but we tend to think of our employees and our parents and even students who are of age to vote. We have a requirement in our state, and I'm sure it is in a lot of states, to register students when they're eligible to vote. Then a lot of school districts get criticized for doing that when it comes time for a bond election, because they say that's advocacy. You can't have it both ways. We're either encouraging a culture of voting or we're not, and I think we need to not be afraid to do that. We need to encourage people to vote. We're not telling them how to vote. We're not telling the seniors how to vote, but we need this next generation to be voters. We need them to believe in the democratic process and the democracy of electing and making decisions close to home. And so those target audiences, think about all the different ways. In your internal audience, you have senior students, you have parents, but you don't just have parents, you have some subgroups. You might have non-English speaking parents, parents of special ed students, or gifted and talented students. You might have something in a bond election that includes career and technology education. And so it might be families who access CTE programs and things like that. So your target audiences get narrower and narrower as you start talking about who's impacted by that election. External audiences can be what we would consider taxpayers or citizens who are not registered. So you want them to get registered. They can be taxpayers or citizens who have voted in the past 5 elections and are more likely to vote. So you can start narrowing those groups down too. And then you match your messaging and the things that you want to accomplish in your measurable objectives to those target audiences. And so that messaging is very targeted and it's very specific. What you're communicating, for instance, to senior citizens is different than what you're communicating to citizens who live in your school district and have preschool age kids and are just coming in to utilize the system. So I think those goals, measurable objectives, target audiences, and messaging kind of sums up that whole planning stage. Of course, we absolutely endorse having a written plan. I think that walking in and trying to explain all of that to a leadership team that might not understand the 4-step process is difficult, but you hand them a plan and all of a sudden it looks like you got it going on, right? So
Yes, you do.
Yeah, we often do that for our clients, is help them with an election plan. Not only finance plans leading up to an election, but also the actual election communications plan.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now the rubber meets the road. The step that everybody likes to skip to is implementation. So once you have your plan set, what kinds of strategies and tactics should you consider as you implement the plan? Kyle.
All of them. No, go where the people are. However you're communicating regularly, you should use those channels to communicate about elections. You know, if you go where you're actually already doing things. There might be some other ways that you can think of to reach those groups. Like Julie mentioned, we've got an audience, maybe some senior citizens. Might have to set up some different groups or some different presentations, going to the different organizations in the area. There's lots of different options that you can do. And really when you're looking at your tactics, I like to work under the buckets of, our messaging that we're taking from our research and our planning is, what the current situation is, why this question is even on the ballot, why you're doing this, what the plan is, what it will do, so that, what is the outcome of a yes or no vote? What happens next? What was the process of developing this plan? Like we said, did you ask, the local community? What did the survey say? Why, is there something that's expiring that you need to supplement? Is a building going offline, whatever it is. How does, what is the tax impact to the community? How does somebody vote? You need to know when to register, when early voting is, all of those things, all those different ways to vote. Different states make it increasingly difficult to vote based on how they want things to go. I can speak for some states that, you can register at the polling place on the day of the election. I can't do that here. So it's a very, very different thing. And then, you just really want to put it out there of how people can get their questions answered. And it kind of becomes a full-time job for superintendents and whoever else might be in charge of sharing that information. But this is what you do now for a little while. You want to go where the people are. You want to answer the questions that you're hearing. You want an informed community. You don't want to fly under the radar. You don't want to only talk to the people that are going to vote the way that you want to, in my opinion. You want to make sure everybody has the ability to get the factual information about what's going on and be able to talk about it in the community. I've been so excited to share the analogy that a superintendent I'm working with in Louisiana shared with me when we were talking about the tactics of how to go, how to start, and really kind of the frequency and everything of how we're going to communicate. And he said that this is going to sound very Louisiana, but he said it's like boiling a frog. If you are going to boil a frog or crawfish or any of those things, if you put them in hot water, they're going to jump out. If you put them in cold water and turn the heat up, that is how you boil the frog. And after I laughed for about 5 minutes, I said that makes a ton of sense, because we're not trying to, overwhelm people with this incredibly, here's everything all at once. You want to give bite-sized little bits so they can kind of learn throughout the process and figure out the entire situation.
But in this case, we're not harming them.
We're not harming anyone. No frogs were harmed in this election process. But nobody wants to just be slapped with, that's so much, it's so overwhelming. But if you can kind of give me a little bit and keep me informed of the process, give me some time, then I can focus on it. I think it's transparency means you tell everybody. So you got to get out there, and it's okay to pay attention to the chatter that might be out there. We've all seen the Facebook groups. We've all seen the angry posts. We've all seen the misinformation. I think it's good to pay attention to that, but you need to stay out of the mud and be able to stick to your message. We're not going to respond to every single claim, but we are going to share factual information that may help others to, engage with some of those claims. So yeah, if that doesn't set the course for your implementation of just, if you're thinking of doing it, yes, probably do it.
Yeah. We're lucky right now in this time of school communications that we have so many tools available to us. And I know that what works in one community, like Kyle said, may not work in another community, and you got to go to where they are. But there's a lot more happening in the form of text messaging, reminders, sending out graphs and information, even using social media, but graphs and information about the number of voters who have turned out already. Those are great reminders. We worked with one client that mailed 6 postcards, and the return on that investment was great. And they were able to point to that. CESO helped them with those postcards. But I remember even thinking to myself, 6, man, that's a lot. But it wasn't until postcard number 4, people started coming into meetings with them in their hand. And so that repetition, it takes a while to get their attention. And that they were armed with the information and those postcards in hand. They weren't complaining about getting mailings. They actually were asking questions and acknowledging, now I'm at this meeting because I realize we're having an election. We've all been in those times when people go, wait, there was an election? How do we have an election? Sometimes you can point to the fact that the school district didn't necessarily do a great job of getting the word out to everybody that's impacted by the election. But a lot of times it's just understanding that moms and dads are busy, and that there's different ways to reach different groups. And Kyle's right. I think face-to-face is always good. But how many times have we been at bond presentations or election presentations where 2 or 3 people in the audience or the school people outnumber right? The people in the audience. And we still did the presentations because you have to look at every single voter as maybe then going and telling their neighbors and spreading the word. And it's all about transparency and building trust. So we've got so many tools available to us now. You can use calling systems, you can mail. Oh, and then we should have talked about the QR code coming back, right? The QR code, and everybody thought that was kind of a dead deal in 2020, but it's made the biggest comeback. But using QR codes to be able to track people that are receiving something in the mail and then visit your website. There's so many different analytics and ways that you can really reach out to people now. The methodologies are numerous. Remember, well, not everybody might remember this, but I can remember when all you really could do was snail mail something to someone, and it took weeks to get it designed, printed, sorted, bulk mail, and wait for it to get in the home. And you just hoped it was the right timing and got there right before early voting or the election started. But there's lots of different ways to give instant information now. So we're lucky in that sense. And you don't want to bombard them with too complex messages, but you do have to choose a lot of different ways to do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's talk now about evaluation, the last step in the process. We've got about 8.5 minutes left. Once the plan is over, evaluation can just be whether it passed. But as we talked before, there's way more to it. What else should you consider once the election's over?
I think we can cover this kind of quick because it's some of the same ways that you might have researched or measured. I think it's important to go back and look who turned out to the polls. What was your percentage turnout? Look at your objectives that you set. Just look at the data. There's formal research where you can actually do a scientific survey after the fact. What was helpful? Sometimes those surveys will just flat out ask people, did you support or oppose? But other times it gets to that kind of, what helped you in this election? Are you willing to share what information you didn't have? That's all important. And I like to look at the 4-step process as more cyclical. It's more like a circle, not 4 steps and one and done kind of thing. It's that the evaluation that you're doing now is your research for your next election, right? Because you're going to have another one at some point. But there's informal research that's just having conversations with people, the input that you get back from employees, looking over comments on social media. What were issues for people? What are the things that people didn't understand about the budget? Because you can continue your communications going on after that. And you really should look at both quantitative and qualitative. So quantitative may be, again, how many people voted? How many people did we get registered? What was the change in the participation rate from last time to this time? Those types of things. But qualitative can be anecdotal, and it can be just the response that you got from the audience when you gave a presentation. It could be what school board members are hearing from their neighbors, right? So qualitative can also be, how did the media cover your election? Did the editorial board, because some do this still, did they endorse your election or the measure that was on the election? So did you have other groups that stepped up and supported it, even though as a district you remain neutral? So there's a lot of research that you can bring in. And a lot of times people just move on to the next thing. That election passed or it didn't. Definitely, if it didn't pass, you want to launch kind of a listen and learn campaign and to get out there and find out. This becomes even more important if it didn't pass, because there's a reason why it didn't. There are also reasons why it does, and that's important to know. But if it fails, you definitely, and I actually don't like to use if it fails anymore. I say this is kind of my little mantra, is I think that voters reject measures, districts don't fail them. Now, there are lots of reasons why an election doesn't pass, and sometimes those can be a responsibility or something that the district didn't do well. But a lot of times it's because voters have issue with what's being presented, or they didn't understand it. And so that it's the voters that are rejecting. And I think that way our superintendents, I don't like to see a lot of, I'm so disappointed. I like to use we're disappointed that the community didn't understand this, or that the facilities the measure was not successful in providing additional funding for this purpose. But I don't like it to put it on one person. I don't think one person passes or fails something. And I think voters can support something, but they also can reject it for a particular reason. And that's where evaluation becomes so important to find out why.
Find out the reason. Exactly. Well, and you talked about what if people step up to support it. My next question is, what if they step up to oppose it? What if you have organized opposition?
Well, that's always tough. Nobody likes to see that because it's an early indicator when it crops up, and sometimes it doesn't happen until the opposition comes very late. Sometimes some of these efforts are pretty, I call it a little bit stealth. They wait until right before early voting to do that. It's very calculated. The opposition. Sometimes it's very organized across the nation. We're seeing political action committees come out and even use what the old journalist in me likes to call the red herrings, but they use false narratives and other issues to get people stirred up and get them to vote with their feet. And so they use scare tactics, anything to get someone out to react the way they want. And there are political action committees that do support initiatives in your community, but there are a lot of political action committees right now that are working against public education, spreading false narratives, and that is a challenging environment to be in. Answering people's questions, being open to transparency, responding in a timely manner. Kyle said this, if you get down in the mud with people and you get that muckety muck, everybody's going to come out, kind of dirty and smelling foul. So use your own websites, your own emails, your own newsletters, your own social media to answer questions that the opposition may be raising and to clarify facts for people. You may have heard this, but actually here's the facts. And you want to be the credible source in your community. And in most cases, that is what's happening, but they get distracted. They get distracted by what they're reading in Nextdoor and on social media groups and things like that. So it's important to know what people are saying and what the opposition's saying and to correct any facts, but you don't necessarily need to jump on those sites and get in a back and forth with them. You need to really talk to your target audiences.
And it's why it's important to be consistent and clear from the beginning. The first two frequently asked questions should be what happens if it is approved and what happens if it's not. And those real consequences, real things need to stick around. They don't change, and they need to happen if it goes in whatever direction it goes. But people there's certain folks in your district who will never ever support anything, and that's okay. But we can't just market to them.
Right. Okay, we have one question that somebody sent in. Kristen Kathy APR from Alif ISD asked, how do you effectively communicate the dire financial situation a district is in with your teachers without sounding like you're telling them how to vote?
Yeah, that's tricky, but I think we have not done a good job in public ed of creating a culture of voting. So now we're kind of trying to overcorrect a little bit. I know we're dealing in our state with the Attorney General actually trying to sue districts for putting out the get out to vote message. Now there is always a case in there where an individual employee or someone didn't understand what the rules were or violated the rules, and you certainly have to have policies and procedures in place for addressing those. And that's why we always encourage before you call an election to have the superintendent communicate that to employees. But I think this question that is a great question that Kristen asked, but I think it's all the more important that you start early, that people understand your budget situations, that you're doing year-round, constant, consistent communication about your budget situation. It won't feel so last minute and dire if you've told them all along what to expect. It's coming down the line, but you can have a negative financial situation and you can tell them that this vote is, that build a culture of voting to help them understand without telling them how to vote. Or to vote for a particular measure against or for a particular candidate. So I think we've got to do a better job. We can't be afraid of reminding people how important it is to vote. And quite frankly, it's a pretty powerful opportunity that an individual has, but collectively in a community, it can be very powerful. I just think we have to do it. We have to do it anyway.
Exactly. We just have to do it. Well, thank you both for your time. today. This has been wonderful. I hope everyone will join us for our next live episode, which will be Friday, April 12th at 10 a.m. Central. Justin Deering and I are going to be talking about strategic communication planning. So you got a little preview of that today with the 4-step process. If you'd like to ask us a question for us to answer on that episode, email me at nicole.kirby@theceso.com. If you'd like to learn more about CESO and all of the services we offer to school districts, including communications, go to theceso.com. And if you'd like to talk to us about providing communication support in your district or organization, whether that's with an election or anything else, contact our Vice President, Bob Noyed. His contact information is there on the screen, or any of us on the team. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.